We are told he was England's great warrior king, Richard the Lionheart, crusader, castle breaker, a later symbol of courage, but the bloodline that helped make him formidable would also close around him. Before the Holy Land, there was another battlefield, his own family. Before the lion appeared on banners, Richard was a son facing Henry II, a brother among rival heirs, and a prince raised where inheritance could turn blood into a threat. In hostile and later traditions, the Angevins carried a dark phrase, the devil's brood. Not because demons explain them, the curse was medieval myth and political venom. The pattern beneath it was real, father against sons, brothers against brothers, oaths sealed, then broken. So this is not a trial over whether Richard was born a hero or a monster. The sharper question is colder. What kind of family system helps forge a Lionheart, and then helps trap him inside the world it made? If the curse was not supernatural, then the evidence has to be human. Land, titles, ambition, inheritance, and fear pressing on one family until loyalty cracked. Richard needs caution. Call him only a hero, and violence becomes decoration. Call him only a killer, and the verdict arrives before the trial. So we are going to hold that verdict open. First, the record has to show what kind of world trained him, rewarded him, and then demanded payment from everyone around him. To follow that, the family tree matters, because Richard's enemies often shared his blood. The map matters, because England was only one part of the Angevin world. The chronicles matter too, bias and venom included, because they preserve both war and the language used to justify it. And then there is the cost. Castles taken, oaths broken, money drained, kings humiliated, subjects made to pay for conflicts born far above them. Richard was born in 1157. By 1173, before he was 20, he was in open rebellion against his father. In 1189, he took the crown. In 1199, he died still fighting over continental power. Between those dates, the Lionheart legend was made. So was the evidence we need to weigh. And that evidence only makes sense once the family tree opens into a map. Richard was not born into anything like modern England, neat and separate across the Channel. Henry II ruled England, but England was only one part of a much larger machine. Across the water lay Normandy. Below it, Anjou, the family heartland. Around them were Maine and Touraine, and far to the south was Aquitaine, one of the richest and most difficult regions in Western Europe. This was not an empire in the modern sense, with one flag, one bureaucracy, and clean borders. It was a medieval web of lordship, inheritance, homage, castles, ports, and armed loyalties. Some lands came through Henry's blood, some through conquest and bargaining, and the greatest southern peace through Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose marriage to Henry brought her vast inheritance into the Angevin orbit. That marriage made the dynasty powerful enough to frighten kings. It also made the household almost impossible to govern peacefully. On paper, Henry stood above it all. In practice, every son could look at the map and see a claim. Henry, the young king, had been crowned during his father's lifetime, but without full rule. Richard was tied to Aquitaine. Geoffrey was linked to Brittany through marriage politics. John, the youngest, had fewer prospects at first, which made him a piece for his father to move. And this is the part that matters. A castle was not scenery. It meant taxation, justice, soldiers, and prestige. A title was not an ornament. It was a demand for income and obedience. When Henry gave his sons rank but kept real authority, he created princes old enough to resent him, famous enough to attract allies, and land-hungry enough to think rebellion might pay. The French king watched from a smaller royal domain, weaker in direct territory, dangerous in opportunity. A quarrel inside Henry's house could become a weapon. A son angry at his father could become an international alliance. This is the pressure cooker Richard grew up inside, a dynasty where land and family could not be separated. To be a son was to be an heir. To be an heir was to be a threat. In 1173, it snapped. In 1173, the pressure snapped in public. Henry's eldest surviving son, Henry the young king, had been crowned in his father's lifetime, but still had little real power. That was dangerous. Royal status without royal command. When he broke with his father, The family map split open. Richard was about 15. Geoffrey was younger still. Both joined the rebellion against Henry II, turning a quarrel over inheritance and authority into a war across the Angevin world. This was not one angry prince storming out of a hall. It became a cross-channel crisis, drawing in powerful outsiders, including the King of France, and forcing Henry to fight for control on both sides of the water. Eleanor of Aquitaine is central, but her role needs care. Chroniclers and later historians connect her to the revolt, and Henry treated her as a serious threat afterward. But the evidence does not let us make her a puppet master. The sons had ambitions. The nobles around them had interests. The French king had an opening too useful to ignore. For Richard, the lesson was brutal. Blood did not cancel politics. A father could become an enemy. A brother could be an ally today and a rival tomorrow. Even a foreign king could become leverage against your own family. Henry survived the Great Rebellion and forced his sons back into submission. Eleanor was captured and held under restraint for years. Victory did not heal the dynasty. It taught the children the rules. Richard's first great political education was a failed family war. When he returned to Aquitaine, he carried that lesson into the castles and baronial rebellions of his own duchy. Aquitaine was where the family lesson became rule. It was not a quiet inheritance. Aquitaine was vast, proud, and hard to hold. Castles, river crossings, old local rights, and nobles who did not automatically accept an Angevin duke, tightening his grip. Richard had the title of duke, but title was not obedience. In the 12th century, power had to be visible. A ruler appeared in person, rewarded loyalty, punished defiance, and took fortresses that blocked him. A castle was politics in stone. That is where Tailbourg becomes useful as a case file. In 1179, Richard moved against the fortress of Tailbourg, a stronghold associated with baronial resistance in Aquitaine. Chroniclers and later historians treat the campaign as an early moment when his military talent became hard to ignore. Not final proof of everything Richard would become, but a clear glimpse of the ruler before the Crusader legend. A young duke showing rebellious aristocrats that resistance carried a price. His fame did not begin on the road to Jerusalem. It was built first in internal wars, against Christian nobles inside his own inheritance, in the practical brutality of making a fragmented duchy obey. The balance matters. Richard's severity left a mark, but Aquitaine was not a modern state with courts, police, and a settled chain of command. It was an aristocratic world where fortified lords negotiated through homage, marriage, rebellion, siege, and surrender. So the evidence suggests a pattern, not a hidden psychology we can read with certainty. Richard learned speed. He learned pressure. He learned that taking a castle could break more than a wall. It could break confidence around rebels. Mercy and punishment became instruments of rule. Fear could travel faster than an army. Here the Lionheart looks less like a sudden legend and more like a trained operator of Angevin power. Aquitaine gave him rebellious barons, hard terrain, strong fortresses, and a family expectation that weakness invited attack. The crusading image came later. The habits were already here, and once formed, they turned back toward the center of the family tree, Henry II, his father. When those habits turned toward the family center, Richard found an ally who understood a divided house, Philip II of France. Philip was Henry II's great Capetian rival, the king whose power grew whenever the Angevin Empire cracked. By 1189, Richard and Philip were pressing Henry together, not as son and father, but as political partners forcing terms from an aging king. The issue was succession, but also control. Richard wanted his position secured. Henry, after a lifetime of balancing sons against one another, still hesitated and maneuvered. The old method no longer worked. The son raised inside, the method had learned it too well. In July 1189, Henry was forced into a humiliating peace. The sources describe a king physically ill, worn down by campaign and crisis. They also preserve the sharper wound, betrayal from inside his own bloodline. Richard did not murder his father, that matters. Dynastic politics did not need a staged killing to leave real damage. His victory helped bring Henry to the edge of ruin. Days after the settlement, Henry II was dead. Richard's crown did not arrive as a clean, heroic reward. It came through the collapse of the man who had raised, fought, punished, and underestimated him. The family tree had not simply changed hands, it had broken. Now the crown carried a new demand. Kingship would not end the wars, it would give Richard a kingdom to spend on them. Kingship gave Richard a kingdom to spend. Almost immediately, the ledger opened. He was crowned in 1189. By 1199, he was dead. In that 10-year reign, the king, later remembered as one of England's great national heroes, spent only a small fraction of his time in England itself, often summarized as less than 6 months. That absence shows what England had become inside the Angevin machine, not the center of Richard's world, but one of its strongest financial engines. First came the Crusade. Ships had to be hired, men equipped, supplies moved across sea routes far beyond the Channel. Richard sold offices, raised revenues, and drew heavily on his realm because Holy War, however glorious in memory, had a practical appetite. Then came captivity. On his return from Crusade, Richard was seized in Europe and handed into imperial custody. The price for his release was staggering: 150,000 marks. Not a neat modern number we can convert with confidence, but in 12th century terms, an extraordinary ransom. This is where the story becomes visible in process, not just policy. Clerks counted, sheriffs collected, church treasure could be inventoried. Coins moved from local communities into royal hands, then outward into diplomacy and war. The famous king in chains became a problem for people who had never chosen his quarrel. When Richard returned, the spending continued. The struggle with Philip II pulled him back into continental campaigning, castles, mercenaries, sieges, and repairs to the family empire whose fractures had shaped him. Now the family story has a bill. Sons fought fathers, brothers watched brothers. The French king exploited cracks, and ordinary subjects paid in coin, service, and uncertainty. Richard could inspire loyalty and command armies with rare force, but his reign left an empty space where present kingship should have been. Into that space stepped another Angevin shadow, John. He had learned from the same family school, and while Richard's final campaign still pulled him across the continent, the throne John would inherit already looked less like a prize than a debt waiting for an owner. That unfinished continental struggle led Richard back, again and again, to the contested lands of his family empire. In 1199, the vast Angevin map narrowed to a small stronghold in the Limousin, Châlus-Chabrol. The reasons for the siege are reported differently. Some accounts connect it to treasure, others place it inside the ordinary struggle to enforce lordship in a difficult region. Either way, the scale matters. Richard the Lionheart did not meet his end in a final clash with Saladin, beneath Jerusalem, or in a grand trial worthy of the legend. He was wounded during a minor siege on the edge of his continental possessions, and died soon after, in April 1199. For a legend, it is a strangely quiet ending. The king who crossed seas, broke rebellions, defied his father, humbled rivals, and drained kingdoms for war, was brought down by the same restless frontier politics that had shaped his life from the beginning. Eleanor, his mother, was still alive. In many accounts, she was near him at the end, the woman whose marriage helped create the empire and whose sons tore it open. Richard left no legitimate child to steady the succession. The crown passed to John. The family story did not close. It passed to another brother, the brother who had watched, schemed, waited, and inherited the burdens of Angevin kingship took the throne. The map remained cracked, the crown remained heavy, and the pattern people called a curse kept moving through the bloodline. Pride, inheritance, war, betrayal. Richard's node fades, John's crown rises. The old question returns, stripped of legend. What did this dynasty make of the Lionheart? The answer is not simple. Richard was a gifted commander, fast in decision, relentless in siege warfare, and courageous enough that even hostile memory could not easily erase his force. That is why the Lionheart survived in memory. Medieval fame rewarded victory, crusading symbolism, and the king who seemed to live in armor. But beside the legend stands another image. A son rebelling against his father, a ruler hardened in Aquitaine before he became a crusading icon, A crown won through dynastic collapse. A kingdom treated as a treasury for wars, ransom, and continental ambition. A line of brothers inheriting not peace, but each other's enemies. So the answer is not hero or monster. It is colder than that. The Devil's Brood was not a demonic bloodline. It was a myth, a political story, a dark family joke that accidentally named something real. A house where power outranked blood so often that betrayal began to look like government. Richard did not invent that world. He mastered it. Then it closed around him. Stay with the archive. More crowns wait here. Glory from a distance, warning signs up close.